the scratch of a fountain pen, and then the silence of 10,000 men bleeding into the Serbian mud. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a tactical suicide. How did the world's most powerful empire, a machine of steel, steam, and millions of lives, surrender to a mounting pile of corpses because of 4 words? Go home, sit still. A billion-pound war effort defeated by its own vanity. But that was only the surface. While the starched collars in Whitehall laughed at a lady's ambition, an entire army in the East was vanishing into the earth. They saw a lace collar. They should have seen the only blade sharp enough to save them. Why did the British command ignore the only tactic that could save an entire army from extinction? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the hands of the underdog. August 1914. London is a city possessed by a strange, electric fever. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of a nation pivoting toward industrial slaughter. Everywhere there's the rhythm of the machine, the rhythmic thud of boots on cobblestone, the hiss of steam from departing troop trains. The Great War has arrived, and with it, a terrifyingly efficient bureaucracy of death. In the heart of this machine sits Whitehall. Here, the ceilings are high, the mahogany is polished to a mirror shine, and the silence is intentional. It is the silence of men who believe they have already won because they own the maps and the manuals. Dr. Elsie Inglis walks through these halls, her footsteps a sharp, defiant staccato against the muffled carpet. She is 50 years old, a surgeon who has spent decades navigating the intricate, bloody geography of the human body. She knows what happens when a system fails. She knows that a body, like an empire, can look perfect on the outside while rotting from within. She is not here as a supplicant. She is here as a general of a different kind. Behind her stands the Scottish Women's Hospitals, a fully realized, self-funded unit of surgeons, nurses, and ambulance drivers. They aren't asking for permission to help. They are offering a turnkey solution to the greatest logistical nightmare in human history, the mobile battlefield hospital. But the office she enters is not a place of logic. It is a cathedral of tradition. The official behind the desk, a man whose uniform is as stiff as his worldview, does not look at her medical record. He does not see the years of surgical brilliance or the organizational genius that has already secured thousands of pounds in funding. He sees a woman in a room where women are meant to be ornaments, not agents of change. He represents the establishment, a system that prioritizes the natural order over the preservation of life. To him, the war is a gentleman's game, a sacred masculine ritual where the rules are more important than the results. He leans forward, the light catching the gold braid on his shoulder. He offers a representative quote of hubris, the mindset that would eventually fill the graveyards of Europe. "My good lady," he says, with a smile that feels like a closing door, "go home and sit still." In his mind, the matter is settled. The manual of war does not include female surgeons. Therefore, female surgeons do not exist. It is a fatal flaw of the aristocratic mind, the belief that if a solution doesn't fit the existing hierarchy, it isn't a solution at all. While the British establishment slammed its doors, believing their safety protocols of gender and rank would protect the dignity of the army, they had already committed their first and most grievous strategic error. They treated the silence of Whitehall as a sign of control. But outside those doors, the world was beginning to scream. 3,000 miles to the east, the Eastern Front is not a line on a map. It is a hemorrhage. The Serbian army, small but ferocious, is facing an onslaught that defies the imagination. But they aren't just being killed by Austrian bullets. They are being killed by the mechanical failure of the medical system itself. Consider the fatal flaw of the early 1914 casualty chain. When a soldier is struck in the thigh by a high-velocity projectile, the trauma is not just a hole in the skin. The kinetic energy shatters the femur, sending bone shards through the femoral artery. In the language of the battlefield, this is an input of trauma. The black box of the disaster is the evacuation. Because the military establishment refused to prioritize mobile surgical units, the wounded man must be carried by hand for miles over broken mountain paths. In that time, the mechanical failure of the body accelerates. Without immediate stabilization, the blood volume drops. The heart enters a state of hypovolemic shock, and the lack of oxygenated blood causes the organs to shut down in a cascade of failure. The output is simple: death. Not from the wound itself, but from the distance between the wound and the surgeon. Whitehall believed that the traditional, slow-moving military hospitals were sufficient because the manual said they were. They scoffed at Elsie's mobile units, believing the front was no place for a woman's sensibilities. They treated her warning as a minor budget issue, an annoyance to be swiped away. But the mountain respects no rank. While the British command toasted to their own brilliance in London clubs, a microscopic fracture, the true master of the deep, began to unzip the very fabric of the Serbian defense. They had fatally underestimated the enemy, but more importantly, they had underestimated the ghost in the machine. While the generals were still debating the propriety of female nurses, Elsie Inglis was already in the dark of a rented warehouse in Edinburgh. She wasn't sitting still. She was overseeing the crating of X-ray machines, the calibration of surgical tools, and the training of women who could change a truck tire in a mud pit as easily as they could suture an abdominal wound. The contrast was absolute. In London, there was the loud, panicked incompetence of a system that couldn't see past its own ego. In the shadows of Scotland, there was the quiet, lethal competence of a hero who was already holding the silence that would eventually save a nation. The official in Whitehall had given his order. He believed he had neutralized the nuisance of Dr. Inglis. He sat in his chair, confident that the system was secure. But he had forgotten the first rule of history. When you tell a genius to sit still, you don't stop the movement. You only lose the right to lead it. The storm was coming, and the men in charge were holding umbrellas made of paper. January 1915. Kragujevac, Serbia. The air in the city does not move. It hangs, heavy and cloying, saturated with the scent of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and a sweet, rotting undertone that clings to the back of the throat. This is the city of death, the epicenter of a collapse that no artillery shell could ever achieve. While the world focuses on the trenches of the West, the Eastern Front is being dismantled from the inside out. There are no grand maneuvers here. There is only the slow, rhythmic sound of wooden carts on cobblestones, carrying the day's harvest of the dead. Into this charnel house step the women in gray. They arrive not with fanfare, but with the clatter of crates and the smell of carbolic acid. They are the Scottish Women's Hospitals Unit, led by Elsie Inglis, the woman Whitehall told to stay home. They find a reality that defies the manual of war. In the local hospitals, there are no bandages. There is no space. Men are crammed 3 to a bed, the living tangled with the dying, their uniforms matted with the filth of the trenches. But the greatest threat isn't the wounds. It is the invisible passenger they brought back with them. The fatal flaw of the Serbian defense wasn't a lack of courage. It was a lack of soap. The enemy is Rickettsia prowazikai typhus. To understand the disaster, you must understand the mechanism of the microbe. The process begins when a louse, seeking warmth, migrates from a discarded uniform to a human host. As it feeds, it leaves behind a microscopic input, infected waste. When the soldier scratches the bite, he rubs the bacteria into his own bloodstream. The black box of the disease begins its work. The bacteria invade the cells lining the blood vessels, causing them to swell and burst. The circulation fails. The brain begins to cook in a fever-bright delirium, and the body's cooling system simply gives up. The output is a system crash of the human organism. Within days, 1,000 souls a day are being erased. As Elsie walks the wards, she is met with the crystallized arrogance of the local military command. A high-ranking attaché, his chest heavy with medals that mean nothing in the face of a microbe, watches her team with a thin, mocking smile. He sees women with mops and boiling water, and he sees a waste of time. "We need more morphine, doctor," he says, his voice a reconstruction of the prevailing hubris. "Not more laundry. Cleanliness is a luxury for peacetime. This is war." It was the classic blind spot. He believed that because the disease was carried by something small and domestic, it could be ignored in favor of soldierly problems. He treated the epidemic as a nuisance, a feminine distraction from the masculine business of dying for one's country. But Elsie Inglis was not a guest. She was a scientist. While the authorities were busy counting their remaining bullets, she was already in the shadows, identifying the ghost in the machine. She realized what the experts missed. The hospital wasn't a sanctuary, it was an incubator. The very structure designed to save the army was the engine of its destruction. The manual said to keep the men together for efficiency. Elsie saw that efficiency was the fatal flaw. She initiates the cognitive bridge. Because she had spent years in the slums of Edinburgh, fighting the diseases of the poor, she saw a pattern the military elite could not. To the generals, the louse was an annoyance. To Elsie, the louse was the primary combatant. The women in gray trade their protest banners for radical hygiene protocols. They begin a war of total sanitation. They don't just wash the men, they strip the system bare. They create disinfection trains, mobile units, where uniforms are steamed and bodies are scrubbed until the skin is raw. They implement a strict isolation policy that the male doctors call hysterical. While the establishment screamed about the unnecessary cost of coal for the boilers, the women in gray were already in the dark, holding the silence of the wards. They worked in shifts that blurred day into night. Their hands cracked from the cold and the constant sting of disinfectant. They were the invisible agents, the underdogs fighting a ghost that the massive system of the army didn't even recognize as an enemy. The tension in the city begins to coil like a spring. Every day, the nurses check their own skin for the telltale rash. Every day, they see the bitter irony of their situation. They are the only thing standing between the Serbian nation and total extinction, yet they are still treated as lady volunteers playing at war. But the boss, in this case, biology, is about to deliver its judgment. The attaché who mocked the laundry, the man who believed his rank made him immune to the feminine by concerns of hygiene. He continues to move through the unscrubbed sectors of the city. He treats the warnings of the women in gray as a minor budget issue, an overreaction by the weaker sex. He believes his starched uniform is a shield. He is fatally mistaken. The silence in his quarters is not submission. It is the calm before the storm. A single louse, the true master of the front, has already found a home in the gold braid of his sleeve. While he sits in the mess hall, dismissive and confident, the black box of infection has already begun to unzip his life. He has underestimated the hammer of the invisible killer, and the punishment for his pride will be cold, delirious, and final. The epidemic is about to peak, and the women in gray are the only ones who aren't surprised. November 1915. The mountains of Albania. The system of the Serbian defense has finally fractured under the weight of three converging empires. The order is given. The Great Retreat. It is a phrase that sanitizes the reality of a nation being ground into the ice. This is no longer a war of strategy. It is a war of gravity and thermodynamics. Consider the mechanism of exposure. The input is a human body forced to climb to an elevation of 5,000 feet in a linen uniform, fueled by nothing but frozen bread. The black box is the physiological system error of hypothermia. As the core temperature drops, the blood retreats from the extremities to protect the heart, leaving the fingers and toes to blacken and die. The brain, starved of warmth, begins to hallucinate, mistaking the freezing cold for a burning heat. Men strip off their clothes in the snow, a final, fatal, mechanical failure of the mind. The output is a trail of 70,000 corpses that will not be found until the spring thaw. The manual of war dictated that the hospitals must flee first to preserve the medical staff. The experts argued that a surgeon is a high-value asset, too expensive to be lost to the enemy. But Elsie Inglis looked at the yes, but of the situation. Yes, she could save herself. But who would stay with the men who could not walk? While the system scrambled for the coast, Elsie stayed. She chose the silence of a prisoner of war camp over the safety of the retreat. For months, she and her women lived on the bitter aftertaste of captivity, scavenging for scraps to feed their patients, defying their Austrian captors with a quiet, lethal dignity that no prison wall could contain. When she is finally repatriated in late 1916, she does not go home to sit still. She goes to Russia. She follows the carnage to the Dobruja, a landscape of salt and fire, where she drives her unit to the very edge of human endurance. But there is a ghost in the machine that Elsie cannot outmaneuver. Inside her own body, a fatal flaw has been quietly unzipping her life. It is cancer. It is the one enemy she cannot scrub away with carbolic acid or suturing with silk. She keeps the secret with a forensic precision, working through the pain that would have collapsed a lesser soul. She refuses to be the underdog of her own story. November 26, 1917, Newcastle upon Tyne. The ship HMHS Parthenia moors against the grey, salt-cracked docks of northern England. The wind is a razor, smelling of industry and the North Sea. On the deck, a figure appears. Dr. Elsie Inglis is a shadow of the woman who stood in Whitehall 3 years ago. She is skeletal, her skin the color of old parchment. But she has performed a final act of resistance personification. She has forced her failing muscles to cooperate for one last hour. She stands on the deck in her full uniform, her women in gray coat buttoned to the chin, her medals awarded by Serbia, by Russia, by France catching the pale English sun. She salutes her staff. It is a time freeze moment. There is no sound but the lapping of the water and the distant cry of a gull. In this second, the physical world seems to pause. She has completed the disrespect and retribution arc. She was told she was unfit for the front. She returns having saved an entire nation's soul. 24 hours later, in a quiet hotel room, the system of Elsie Inglis finally reaches its terminal output. She dies in the darkness, having seen her, women in gray, safely home. But here is where the weaponized irony of history leaves its most bitter mark. As word of her death spreads, the nation of Serbia enters a period of mourning usually reserved for kings. They call her the mother of the nation. They name streets after her, build fountains in her memory, and carry her name in their hearts as a sacred talisman. And Britain, the system she served with such fierce, unrequited loyalty? Whitehall remains chillingly silent. There is no state funeral. There is no posthumous damehood. The men in the starched collars, the ones who told her to sit still, simply adjust their files. To them, she was a mechanical error in their hierarchy that had finally been corrected by death. They buried her story in the footnotes, a blind spot in the official history of the Great War. They thought that by ignoring her, they could erase the embarrassment of their own incompetence. But the truth has a way of outliving the bureaucrats. We see this same hubris in our society today. We see systems that prioritize the protocol over the person, and massive organizations that would rather fail by the book than succeed by the hand of an outsider. We still live in a world where the experts dismiss the warnings of the underdogs, only to wonder why the machine keeps breaking. The story of Elsie Inglis is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a mirror. It asks us, who are the people we are telling to sit still today? What genius are we discarding because it doesn't fit our manual? Institutional pride is a high price to pay for the lives of those we are meant to protect. And perhaps, a century later, it is finally time we stopped sitting still and started listening to the ghosts of those who knew better. If you believe that stories like Elsie Inglis's deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing and like this video to help us bring her out of the shadows. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.